From family gathering to family war, all because I wouldn't babysit. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. My mother looked me dead in the eye and said I was destroying the family, all because I refused to watch Paw Patrol. The screaming echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the luxury lake house. I stood there, a 28-year-old woman with a successful career, being berated like a disobedient child. My sister Claire, 34 and supposedly the epitome of suburban grace, was weeping dramatically into a designer tissue. My mother, Helen, stood like a sentinel protecting her golden child, her face red with sheer indignation. "You are completely selfish, Maya," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "Your sister is exhausted. She needs a break. Family helps family." I looked around the room. My aunts, uncles, and cousins were all staring at me with a mixture of shock and harsh judgment. I had always been the designated family doormat. Need someone to pick up the cake? Call Maya. Need a free babysitter so Claire can get a manicure? Call Maya. It was an unspoken rule that my time was entirely worthless, while Claire's time was precious. But I was severely burnt out. I had just finished an 80-hour week at my job, and I had paid my own hard-earned money to be at this week-long family reunion. I was promised rest, relaxation, and absolutely no responsibilities. Yet, less than 2 hours after I had unpacked my bags, the demand was made. Claire wanted to leave her 3 chaotic, screaming toddlers with me for the entire afternoon. Have you ever realized your family's love was strictly conditional? That realization hit me like a freight train as I watched my mother's furious eyes bore into mine. They didn't love me for who I was. They loved me for what I could do for them. The utility I provided was my only currency in this family. I took a deep breath, feeling my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wasn't going to cave this time. I looked at my mother, then at my sister's fake, perfectly manicured tears. "No," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "I am not watching her kids." The sheer audacity of my refusal sent shockwaves through the room, turning a picturesque family gathering into an absolute nightmare. Little did they know, my simple refusal would uncover a secret that destroyed everything. To understand how we reached this boiling point, you have to understand the deeply ingrained hierarchy of my family. For as long as I can remember, Claire has been the undisputed sun around which my mother, Helen, desperately orbits. Claire was the beautiful cheerleader, the academic overachiever, and eventually, the woman who married Greg, a wealthy and relentlessly hard-working software executive. I, on the other hand, was the reliable shadow. I was parentified from the moment I could tie my own shoes. If Claire had a major project due, I was the one doing her assigned chores so she wouldn't be stressed. When she had her 3 kids in rapid succession, I became the unpaid, heavily presumed upon weekend nanny. My own accomplishments, graduating with honors, securing a demanding job as a logistics manager, were barely acknowledged. "That's nice, Maya," my mother would say dismissively, before instantly pivoting the conversation to Claire's new kitchen renovations or her children's private preschool. The anxiety leading up to this annual lake house trip had been eating me alive for weeks. The rental was a sprawling, extravagant estate in the mountains, paid for entirely by everyone pitching in their fair share. I had contributed a significant sum, hoping against hope that this year would be different. I had promised my therapist that I would enforce my boundaries. No free labor, no endless diaper changes, no giving up my bed for the kids. But as I packed my suitcase in my quiet, peaceful apartment, my stomach was tied in agonizing knots. I knew exactly how my mother operated, and I knew how fiercely Claire clung to her carefully curated image of the exhausted, flawless supermom who just needed a little bit of grace. I was terrified of the conflict I knew was coming, but I was even more terrified of losing myself entirely to their endless, suffocating demands. I carefully zipped up my luggage, taking one last look at the comforting sanctuary of my apartment before heading out the door. The 2-hour drive to the lake house felt like a slow march to an inevitable execution. I packed my bags, unaware I was driving straight into a catastrophic family war. The arrival at the massive lake house was exactly as chaotic and overwhelming as I had feared. The property was stunning, featuring an enormous wraparound wooden deck, a private dock, and enough bedrooms to comfortably house the 15 family members who had RSVP'd. I pulled my car into the sprawling gravel driveway, taking a deep breath of the fresh mountain air to steel my nerves. Almost immediately, my sister Claire came rushing out the front door, her 3 toddlers swarming around her ankles like angry bees. She was dressed in expensive athleisure wear, holding a large iced coffee and looking incredibly frantic. "Oh, thank God you're finally here, Maya," she gasped, not even bothering to offer a greeting or ask about my drive. "I have absolute incredibly important errands to run in town, and Greg is stuck at the office until late tonight. I need you to take the kids to the lake right now." She practically shoved her youngest son into my arms before I had even opened the trunk of my car. Have you ever noticed how entitled people don't ask? They just inform you of what you are going to do? For a split second, my ingrained programming kicked in. My arms instinctively reached out to take the heavy toddler. But then I remembered the exhaustion in my bones, the 80-hour work week, and the simple fact that I was on vacation too. I took a deliberate step back, letting my arms fall firmly to my sides. "No, Claire," I said, my voice clear and unwavering in the crisp afternoon air. "I'm not watching your kids today. I just got here, I need to unpack, and I am officially off duty for the week." Claire stopped dead in her tracks, her iced coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rim of the cup. She blinked at me rapidly, as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. The kids continued to scream and pull at her expensive leggings, but she didn't seem to notice them anymore. Her eyes narrowed into tiny, dangerous slits. The silence on the driveway was deafening as Claire's perfect smile slowly melted away. It only took 3 seconds for my mother, Helen, to materialize from the house, drawn by the sudden, unnatural silence between her 2 daughters. She marched down the wooden steps, her eyes darting between Claire's furious face and my calm, resolute posture. "What is going on out here?" she demanded, instantly placing a protective hand on Claire's shoulder. "Maya, why is your sister upset? She has a very stressful afternoon planned." I kept my voice perfectly level. "Claire asked me to babysit, and I politely declined. I'm on vacation." My mother's jaw dropped in absolute horror. "Politely declined? Maya, you are being incredibly selfish. Your sister has 3 small children, and you have absolutely no responsibilities in your life. You will take these children down to the lake right now, or you will pack your bags and leave." The sheer unfairness of her words ignited a hot, furious fire in my chest. I worked grueling shifts managing an entire regional supply chain, while Claire spent her days at Pilates and country club brunches. Yet, in my mother's eyes, I was the one without a life. The screaming match erupted instantly. My mother hurled insults about my supposed lack of empathy, while Claire wailed dramatically about how her mental health was entirely dependent on this quick break. But instead of shrinking, I felt a strange sense of liberation wash over me. I wasn't going to play their twisted game anymore. I calmly reached into my pocket, my fingers closing tightly around my car keys. "If my presence here is entirely conditional on being unpaid labor, then I'll happily leave for the day," I stated firmly. I didn't even bother opening my trunk. I turned my back on their screaming faces, climbed right back into the driver's seat of my car, and locked the doors. I shifted the car into reverse, ignoring my mother frantically tapping on the glass. As I pulled out of the driveway and onto the quiet mountain road, my heart pounded furiously. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, wondering if I had just made a massive mistake. I spent the entire afternoon exploring a nearby small town, sitting in a quiet cafe with a book, and thoroughly enjoying the absolute peace. When I finally returned to the sprawling lake house just before dinner, the atmosphere had shifted from explosive anger to a chilling, calculated hostility. As I walked through the front door, the lively conversations abruptly ceased. My aunts and uncles suddenly found the intricate patterns on the hardwood floor incredibly fascinating. I walked into the massive, open-concept kitchen where my mother was aggressively chopping vegetables. She didn't even look up as she hissed, "I hope you enjoyed your little selfish tantrum. Claire is upstairs crying because you ruined her entire afternoon." I ignored the bait, pouring myself a glass of water and retreating to the wraparound porch. I was officially exiled from the inner circle, ostracized for the unforgivable crime of wanting a vacation on my actual vacation. But as I stood alone in the cool evening air, looking out at the dark water of the lake, the sliding glass door quietly opened. My cousin Julian, the designated black sheep of our extended family, stepped out holding 2 bottles of beer. Julian was an artist who openly rejected my mother's obsession with status, making him the only person who truly understood my pain. He handed me a bottle and leaned against the wooden railing. "You know, you really kicked the hornet's nest today," he chuckled softly, taking a long sip of his drink. "But for what it's worth, I'm incredibly proud of you. It's about time someone told them no." I sighed heavily, expressing my exhaustion with the constant manipulation. Julian nodded thoughtfully, but his expression suddenly turned serious. He glanced back through the glass doors, scanning the living room to ensure no one was within earshot. He stepped slightly closer to me, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. Julian leaned in close and whispered that Claire was hiding something huge from everyone. Julian explained that while I was gone, Claire hadn't been crying upstairs like my mother claimed. Instead, she had been pacing relentlessly around the property, acting like a cornered animal. My curiosity was instantly piqued. The next morning, I intentionally woke up before dawn, making myself a cup of coffee and sitting quietly in the shadowed corner of the massive living room. The house was dead silent, save for the rhythmic sound of the waves hitting the dock. Suddenly, I heard the rapid, heavy thud of footsteps descending the wooden stairs. It was Claire. She was completely unaware of my presence in the darkroom. I watched in absolute fascination as she bypassed the kitchen entirely and practically threw herself out onto the front porch. She was having what looked like a literal panic attack. Her breathing was ragged, her hands were trembling violently, and she was aggressively biting her lower lip. She pulled a phone out of her pocket, but it wasn't her usual, glittering designer iPhone. It was a cheap, plastic model with a thick black case, a burner phone. Have you ever seen someone's carefully constructed mask completely fall off when they think no one is watching? Claire's face was twisted in sheer, unadulterated terror. Her thumbs flew rapidly across the tiny screen, furiously typing out message after message. She kept looking over her shoulder, her eyes wide and bloodshot, terrified that Greg might unexpectedly pull into the driveway a day early. This wasn't the behavior of an exhausted mother who just desperately needed a simple spa day to unwind. This was the behavior of someone whose entire life was teetering on the absolute edge of a catastrophic cliff. She held the phone to her ear for a few seconds, let out a frustrated, muffled scream, and aggressively ended the call. Her desperation to leave the property yesterday wasn't about running errands. It was an absolute, terrifying emergency. I watched from the window as she shoved the burner phone deep into her purse. After witnessing the bizarre burner phone incident, Julian and I officially formed a quiet, investigative alliance. We agreed to keep our eyes and ears completely open, meticulously tracking Claire's erratic behavior and every frantic move she made around the house. Later that afternoon, the large lake house was aggressively buzzing with loud activity as everyone prepared for a massive family barbecue. I was conveniently banished to the back patio to scrub the heavy iron grill, giving me a perfectly unobstructed vantage point of the side yard. Julian was casually tossing a football nearby, pretending to ignore the rising tension. Through the slightly open laundry room window, we suddenly heard Claire's hushed, incredibly frantic voice. She was speaking desperately fast, her tone dripping with sheer, unadulterated panic. "I told you I don't have the rest of the money right now. My husband tracks all of our joint accounts. I need more time. Just give me until Friday." She hissed violently into the receiver. Julian and I immediately exchanged a sharp, knowing glance. That afternoon, Claire dramatically marched into the kitchen and loudly announced to my mother that her stress levels were severely peaking, and she had booked an emergency, 3-hour deep tissue massage at the luxury resort spa directly across the lake. She practically sprinted out the front door, leaving my enabling mother to happily wrangle the 3 screaming kids without a single complaint. The very moment her expensive SUV disappeared down the long, dusty gravel driveway, Julian quickly pulled his personal phone out of his pocket. "Let's test a little theory," he muttered under his breath, rapidly Googling the direct phone number for the luxury spa she had just so loudly referenced to the entire family. He put the call on speakerphone and casually asked the polite receptionist if his sister, Claire, had accidentally left her designer sunglasses in the waiting room prior to her 3-hour appointment. The silence that followed stretched on for what felt like an absolute eternity, heavily hanging in the tense air between us. The receptionist confirmed that no one named Claire had ever booked an appointment there. The realization that Claire was actively lying about her whereabouts sent a deep, uncomfortable chill straight down my spine. The completely fake spa trip was just the terrifying tip of a massive, heavily concealed iceberg. By Thursday morning, the sheer tension in the sprawling lake house had reached a boiling, entirely unbearable climax. Claire was visibly deteriorating right before our very eyes. The dark circles under her eyes were impossible to conceal with makeup, and she was jumping violently at every single notification sound her phone made. Her husband, Greg, was finally scheduled to arrive late that evening, and Claire was acting exactly like a woman whose execution date was rapidly approaching. Around noon, she blindly attempted a desperate, entirely forced drop-off. She aggressively marched into the quiet living room where I was peacefully reading a book, completely ignoring my firmly established boundaries. She literally shoved her two youngest, heavily crying children onto the large leather sectional sofa, dropped a massive diaper bag aggressively onto the glass coffee table, and immediately turned on her heel. "I have a massive emergency. Watch them right now," she commanded sharply, not even bothering to look me in the eye as she practically sprinted toward the heavy front door. "Claire, absolutely not. Come back here right now," I yelled, standing up quickly. But the heavy oak doors simply slammed shut in my face, and mere seconds later, her tires furiously spun out on the loose gravel driveway. My mother was asleep upstairs, and the rest of the extended family was down by the water. I was entirely alone with two screaming toddlers. It was the absolute ultimate test of my resolve. Would I cave and fall back into my old role, or would I maintain the boundary causing this war? I took a deep, steadying breath, pulled out my cell phone, and immediately scrolled to my brother-in-law's contact information. Greg was a decent guy, entirely oblivious to his wife's manipulative nature. The phone rang exactly 3 times before he finally picked up the line, the background noise indicating he was driving. Greg answered the phone sounding completely oblivious to his wife's chaotic and sudden disappearance. "Hey Maya, I'm actually making great time. I'll be at the lake house in about 2 hours, Greg said cheerfully through the car's Bluetooth system. I kept my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion. "That's great, Greg. I just wanted to let you know that Claire just dumped the kids in the living room and drove off for an emergency. Since I am officially not babysitting this trip, you need to hurry up and come get them." There was a heavy, confused pause on the other end of the line. "An emergency?" "She didn't text me anything about an emergency," he muttered, sounding deeply concerned. I hung up the phone, feeling a sharp twinge of guilt, but quickly pushed it aside. To keep the toddlers occupied until their father arrived, I reached into the massive diaper bag and pulled out the large iPad Claire always used to pacify them. I unlocked the screen, intending to just pull up a mindless cartoon, but the device froze for a brief second as it furiously connected to the house's Wi-Fi network. Suddenly, a chaotic barrage of notifications began flooding the top of the illuminated screen. They weren't standard text messages. They were from a heavily encrypted messaging app that had somehow accidentally synced to the family tablet. My eyes widened in absolute, sheer horror as I read the preview text of the incoming messages. "Claire, the wire transfer bounced again. If I don't have the remaining $40,000 by tonight, I am sending the entire file to your husband." It wasn't an affair. My perfect, golden child sister was currently being aggressively blackmailed over a massive, devastating financial scam. I felt the blood completely drain from my face as I quickly tapped on the notification icon, bypassing the lock because the iPad was already open. The entire horrifying chat history loaded instantly before my eyes. Claire had secretly funneled tens of thousands of dollars from Greg's corporate business accounts to a fake investment guru who was now maliciously extorting her for even more money. Her perfect, wealthy lifestyle was entirely built on a terrifying mountain of criminal fraud and desperate, frantic lies. The message on the screen revealed a betrayal far worse than anyone could have imagined. My hands shook violently as I rapidly scrolled through the devastating chat logs. Claire was desperately begging the scammer for more time, explicitly admitting to forging Greg's signature on critical bank documents to secure the initial fraudulent transfer. I didn't hesitate. I immediately used my own phone to take crystal-clear photographs of the iPad screen, ensuring I captured every single damning timestamp and confession before she inevitably realized her catastrophic mistake and remotely wiped the device. I was plunged into the most agonizing moral dilemma of my entire life. Do I take this explosive evidence straight to my mother, who would undoubtedly try to completely bury the scandal to protect her precious golden child? Do I wait for Greg to arrive and destroy his entire life while he was on family vacation? Or do I just quietly pack my bags, drive back to the city, and let this entire toxic family burn to the ground without my involvement? My racing thoughts were abruptly violently interrupted by the heavy sound of footsteps pounding down the wooden stairs. My mother, Helen, had finally woken up from her nap. She took one look at the toddlers sitting quietly on the rug and then glared aggressively at me. "Where is your sister?" she demanded fiercely. "She ran out for an emergency," I replied coldly. My mother's face instantly contorted with absolute, sheer rage. "This is entirely your fault, Maya. If you had just stepped up and watched the kids like a normal, supportive sister, Claire wouldn't be having these massive stress emergencies. You are actively destroying this family with your incredibly selfish, stubborn behavior. Have you ever felt the exact moment when the last remaining shred of your deeply ingrained family loyalty completely evaporates into thin air?" Staring at my mother's furiously red, accusatory face, knowing the terrifying magnitude of the absolute criminal lies her perfect daughter was currently hiding, I felt utterly nothing but cold, hardened resolve. The heavy burden of being the family scapegoat completely lifted off my tired shoulders. My mother's cruel words made my decision to expose the ugly truth incredibly easy. Greg pulled his massive, heavy SUV into the long gravel driveway exactly 2 hours later, looking physically exhausted but genuinely happy to finally join the annual family vacation. Not even 10 minutes after his arrival, Claire frantically sped up directly behind his car, practically jumping out of her expensive vehicle before it was even fully in park. She instantly plastered on the most convincing, sickeningly sweet smile I had ever witnessed, warmly greeting her tired husband with a passionate kiss and a believable, entirely fabricated story about having a sudden, terrible flat tire in town. She was the absolute perfect picture of a devoted, deeply loving wife who had just suffered a minor, incredibly annoying inconvenience. I watched her flawless, Oscar-worthy performance from the large kitchen island, feeling a massive wave of pure, unadulterated disgust wash completely over me. She hadn't even bothered to check to see if I had actually watched her crying kids. She completely assumed I had folded to the pressure, perfectly confident in her lifelong status as the untouchable golden child of the family. I firmly pulled out my phone and sent a quick, incredibly urgent text message to Julian, who was currently reading a book out on the back patio. "It's time. Gather absolutely everyone in the main living room. Right now." Julian didn't ask a single question. Within 5 short minutes, he had efficiently corralled my irritated mother, my aunts, my uncles, Greg, and a very confused Claire into the large, central room. "What is this all about?" my mother asked impatiently, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. "We are trying to relax, and Maya has caused enough unnecessary drama for one entire week." I slowly walked over to the massive smart TV, securely mounted above the beautiful stone fireplace. I pulled up the casting app on my phone, connecting it directly to the large screen. My heart was pounding fiercely in my ears, but my hands were completely steady. I was utterly done being the villain in their heavily fabricated, completely twisted family narrative. I stood at the head of the room with my phone burning in my hand. Since Mom is so incredibly convinced that my absolute selfishness is completely destroying this family, I thought it was perfectly appropriate to clear the air, I announced, my voice echoing loudly across the dead silent room. Claire's been undergoing a massive amount of terrible stress lately, and I finally discovered exactly why. Before my mother could even open her mouth to aggressively interrupt me, I pressed the large cast button on my phone. The enormous 70-inch television screen instantly flashed incredibly bright, displaying the high-resolution screenshots I had taken directly from Claire's synced iPad. The massive text bubbles were magnified for absolutely everyone in the room to read clearly. "Claire, the wire transfer bounced again. If I don't have the remaining $40,000 by tonight, I am sending the entire file to your husband." The entire living room went absolutely, terrifyingly, deathly quiet. You could literally hear a tiny pin drop on the polished hardwood floor. Greg aggressively shoved his way to the very front of the large family crowd, his eyes desperately scanning the horrifyingly explicit messages permanently displayed on the bright screen. His face painfully twisted from total, innocent confusion to absolute, sheer devastation as he quickly read Claire's incredibly desperate responses, explicitly detailing exactly how she had meticulously forged his legal signature to quietly drain his heavily protected corporate business accounts. "What is this, Claire?" Greg choked out, his voice cracking violently under the crushing weight of the massive betrayal. "Please tell me this is some kind of sick, terrible joke." I slowly turned my head to look directly at my older sister. The flawless, untouchable golden child was physically trembling from head to toe. Her carefully curated, incredibly expensive mask hadn't just slipped. It had completely violently shattered into a million tiny, irreparable pieces on the living room floor. She opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. The color completely drained from my sister's face as her husband read the horrific texts. The beautiful, tranquil lake house instantly transformed into an absolute, terrifying active war zone. Greg let out a horrifying, agonizing sound, a deeply painful mixture of profound grief and explosive, unbridled fury, and violently slammed his clenched fist heavily onto the solid wooden dining table. He began aggressively screaming at Claire, demanding to know exactly how much hard-earned money she had criminally stolen from his life's work. Claire dramatically collapsed onto the hardwood floor in complete hysterics, desperately clawing at Greg's pant legs and begging for completely undeserved forgiveness, wildly blaming the fake investment guru for heavily manipulating her innocent trust. But the absolute most shocking reaction came directly from my heavily enabling mother, Helen. Instead of expressing genuine horror at her golden child's massive, unforgivable felony, my mother completely pivoted her blazing, irrational fury directly toward me. "How could you possibly do this to us?" Helen shrieked at the very top of her lungs, forcefully marching toward me with her hands violently balled into incredibly tight fists. "You maliciously snooped through your sister's personal, private things. You deliberately completely ruined her perfect marriage out of sheer, absolute jealousy." The breathtaking, sheer audacity of her completely insane accusation actually made me laugh out loud. It was a cold, incredibly hollow laugh that violently pierced through the deafening chaos of the crowded room. "She stole tens of thousands of dollars, Mom." I yelled right back, completely refusing to back down a single inch. "She committed massive financial fraud, but you are actually mad at me because I finally refused to babysit her kids while she desperately ran from a criminal blackmailer." The deep, toxic generational sickness of my family was completely laid entirely bare in that singular, terrifying moment. There was absolutely no truth, no accountability, and zero justice. There was only the desperate, fanatical protection of the heavily fabricated family image. Screams echoed through the beautiful lake house as 15 years of perfect lies violently imploded. I didn't stick around to witness the final, bloody casualties of the massive, entirely destructive family war. While Greg was furiously packing his bags upstairs and aggressively demanding total, exclusive custody of the crying kids, and my mother was desperately trying to physically block the front door to prevent him from leaving, I quietly slipped away. I efficiently packed my suitcase in completely absolute, beautiful silence. I didn't feel a single ounce of crippling, familiar guilt, nor did I feel the heavy, suffocating anxiety that had entirely plagued my daily existence for the last 28 years. I carefully carried my heavy bag down the wooden stairs, completely ignoring the absolute, violent chaos that was still heavily raging in the main living room. Julian was standing quietly by the front door, deeply watching the horrific, explosive spectacle with entirely sad, highly knowing eyes. He reached out and wrapped me in a fiercely tight, incredibly supportive hug. "You did the absolutely right thing, Maya," he whispered softly into my ear, his voice barely audible over the screaming. "Don't you ever let them try to convince you otherwise." I nodded firmly, completely bypassing my mother, who was currently screaming my name and violently demanding I stay to help fix this enormous, terrible mess. I walked straight out the heavy oak front door, threw my suitcase forcefully into the trunk of my car, and immediately started the engine. As I quickly drove back down the long, dusty gravel mountain road, my phone began violently exploding with completely frantic, furious text messages from aunts, uncles, and my incredibly unhinged mother. Without a single, solitary second of hesitation, I permanently blocked every single one of their phone numbers. I completely severed the deeply toxic, poisonous cord that had heavily bound me to their endless, demanding manipulations for my entire adult life. I turned up the volume on the car radio, deeply inhaling the incredibly crisp, fresh night air flowing steadily through the partially open window. For the first time in my entire life, I felt completely and utterly free. It has been exactly 1 full year since that incredibly explosive afternoon at the Mountain Lake house, and my entire life is completely unrecognizable. The massive, devastating fallout of Claire's heavily guarded secrets was entirely nuclear. Greg immediately filed for highly contested divorce, successfully securing full, absolute custody of the 3 children after the deeply horrifying extent of Claire's massive financial fraud was fully legally uncovered. She is currently completely bankrupt, deeply facing multiple, serious legal charges, and is entirely heavily reliant on our heavily enabling mother, who incredibly still violently blames me for the entire catastrophic situation. I have spent the last 12 months actively working with an incredibly fantastic therapist, deeply unpacking the heavily ingrained, highly toxic generational trauma that strictly defined my entire existence. I learned that completely sacrificing your own mental health and personal boundaries to maintain a completely fake, incredibly toxic family peace is the absolute highest form of personal self-betrayal. I no longer allow anyone to completely dictate my profound worth based on exactly how much deeply unpaid labor I can generously provide for them. My absolutely incredible cousin Julian is currently the only relative I entirely speak to. We regularly meet for quiet coffee and deeply laugh about completely avoiding the deeply exhausting, highly manipulative family group chats. If you are currently sitting in exactly the same heavily suffocating position I once was, constantly acting as the deeply underappreciated, fully designated family doormat, I completely urge you to finally find your voice. You do not strictly owe anyone your profound sanity, your precious time, or your hard-earned peace of mind just because you share the exact same last name. The absolute hardest word to finally say to heavily entitled family members is also the deeply most incredibly powerful tool in your entire arsenal. A simple, firm no. Setting a boundary might burn a bridge, but it will always light your way forward.